My wife passed on a Thursday. By Sunday, my son-in-law had already printed out brochures. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing the same flannel shirt I'd worn to the cemetery. Coffee going cold in front of me. My daughter Ellen came through the door with a casserole from one of her church friends, and right behind her was Marcus, her husband of 11 years, carrying a manila folder that he set on the table before he'd even taken off his coat. "We just want to talk through some practical things," he said. I looked at that folder. Then I looked at my daughter. She didn't meet my eyes. The casserole sat there getting cold too. Helen had been sick for almost 2 years. Pancreatic cancer. She fought it the way she did everything else, quietly, stubbornly, without making a production of her suffering. She still cooked Sunday dinners until 6 weeks before she died. She still called her sister in Tucson every Saturday morning. She still left little notes on the bathroom mirror when she knew I was anxious about a doctor's appointment. Just 3 or 4 words. Sometimes just a drawing of a small bird, which was a thing between us that went back to our first year of marriage, and a story too long to tell here. We were married for 41 years. She died on a Thursday in November, with her hand in mine, and the late afternoon light coming through the curtains she'd picked out herself at a shop in Asheville, on a trip we took for our 35th anniversary. I remember thinking, in that moment, that I was the luckiest and the most wrecked I had ever been in the same breath. And then 4 days later, my son-in-law put a manila folder on my kitchen table. Inside were 2 brochures for assisted living communities, one in Scottsdale, one 20 minutes from where Marcus and Ellen lived in Tempe, and a printout from a real estate website showing estimated sale values for homes in my neighborhood. My home, the house Helen and I bought in 1987, where we raised 2 kids, where we planted the oak tree in the backyard that was now tall enough to give real shade, where every corner had something of her still in it. "The market's strong right now," Marcus said. He was a financial advisor. He talked about markets the way some men talk about sports, casually, like it was just a thing people discussed over cold casseroles at a dead woman's kitchen table. "You'd get a good price. We've been talking to a realtor." "You've been talking to a realtor," I said. "Just preliminary," Ellen said quickly. "Just to get a sense." I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked at my hands around my coffee mug. "Your father can't live alone, Ellen," Marcus said. And the way he said it, patient, reasonable, like he was explaining something to a child, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "He's 68 years old. He's never managed the finances, the insurance, any of it. Helen handled all of that." That part was true, actually. Helen had been the organized one. The one who kept the files and paid the bills and knew where everything was. I was the one who could fix anything with his hands and couldn't find a receipt to save his life. But I had learned, quietly and without telling anyone, over the past 8 months I had learned. Here's what Marcus didn't know. Here's what Ellen didn't know. Here's what Ellen didn't know. Here's what I hadn't told a single person. 10 months before she died, when we'd just gotten the diagnosis and the doctor's prognosis was still something we were learning to hold, Helen sat me down at this same kitchen table, and she looked at me the way she did when she meant something absolutely. She said, "I know you. You're going to fall apart when I'm gone, and then you're going to let other people decide things for you because you'll be too sad to fight. I won't let that happen." I started to argue. She put her hand over mine. "I've been doing something," she said, "for a while now. I need to tell you about it." 3 years earlier, before the diagnosis, before any of this, Helen had inherited money from her mother's estate. Not a fortune, but enough. She hadn't told me exactly what she'd done with it, and I hadn't pressed, because that was how we were. We trusted each other with the parts we knew, and we trusted each other with the parts we didn't. What she had done was this. She'd bought a small house. Not here in Phoenix. Not anywhere Marcus could reach it. A 2-bedroom craftsman bungalow in Brevard, North Carolina, a small city in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 40 minutes from Asheville. She'd bought it 3 years ago, paid cash, had it inspected and painted and quietly furnished, and had been renting it as a vacation property in the meantime to cover the property taxes and basic upkeep. The property was in her name and in her will. She had left it to me, directly, personally. not to be counted among the estate assets subject to family discussion. She'd already spoken to an attorney. The paperwork was clean. It was mine. She handed me a key. It was old-fashioned looking, heavier than I expected on a keychain with a small mountain bluebird. The state bird of North Carolina. I held it in my palm for a long time without speaking. She said, "I always wanted to live somewhere with real seasons." I said, "You should have told me." She said, "I'm telling you now." That was 10 months before she died. In those 10 months, I drove out to Brevard twice. Once with her, when she was still well enough, and once alone, in September, when she was in the hospital and couldn't come. And I went because she asked me to check on the place and sit on the porch for a while and report back. I called her from the porch swing and described the view of the mountains in the late afternoon, and she listened with her eyes closed. I could tell by her voice, and she said it sounded just right. It sounded just right. It sounded just right. So when Marcus put that manila folder on my kitchen table, I knew some things he didn't. I knew that the house in Phoenix was mine to decide about on my own timeline, and no realtor he'd spoken to could change that. I knew that my finances, while not complicated, were intact. Helen had organized everything into a binder that she'd labeled "I'm not kidding" for when I'm gone, and had walked me through it section by section over the summer, and I knew that I had somewhere to go, already paid for, already mine. I didn't say any of that. I picked up the brochure for the Scottsdale community and I looked at it for a moment. "What's the monthly rate?" I asked. Marcus brightened a little. He thought I was engaging. "The one in Scottsdale starts at around 4,000, he said. "The one closer to us is a little less. We could help with the difference." I set the brochure down. I said, "I appreciate you both thinking about me. I'm not making any decisions right now. I was told not to make major decisions in the first year after losing a spouse, and I'm going to follow that advice." "I'd read that somewhere and I was grateful for it," Marcus said. "I understand that, but the market—" "Marcus," I said, and I said it quietly, the way my father used to say things when the conversation was over. "My wife has been gone for 4 days. I'm going to ask you to let me finish my coffee." Ellen looked like she wanted to say something. She didn't. They left about 20 minutes later. Marcus shook my hand at the door. Firm businessman's grip, the kind of handshake that is also a negotiation, and said they'd talk soon. Ellen hugged me. She held on a little longer than usual, and I wondered if some part of her knew something was wrong. Not with me, but with what was happening in that room. The weeks after that followed a pattern I had not expected. Marcus called every few days. Sometimes it was about the house. Sometimes it was framed as checking in on me, but it always circled back. Had I thought more about my options? Had I spoken to anyone about estate planning? Had I considered that sitting on that much real estate without a plan was actually a financial risk at my age? I was patient. I was non-committal. I had learned in 41 years of marriage and 30 years of working as a project manager for a construction firm that the most powerful thing you can do in a room is be the calmest person in it. Ellen came by most weekends. I was glad to see her. She brought food and sometimes we sat and watched old movies and didn't talk about anything painful, and those afternoons were genuinely good. But I noticed that she came less often when Marcus was traveling for work. And I noticed that when he was home, the conversations had a different quality, more pointed, more purposeful. I noticed that she had stopped asking me how I was doing and started asking me what I was doing and started asking me what I was thinking about doing. 2 months after Helen died, Marcus came alone. He said Ellen was at her sister's. He sat down in the chair that used to be Helen's chair, which bothered me more than I showed. And he said he wanted to talk man to man. He said he was worried about me. He said living alone at 68 in a big house with a yard was a lot to manage. He said the house needed updating, the HVAC was old, the roof would need replacing in a few years, the kitchen was dated. All true, he said at my age, putting that kind of money into a property only to sell it in a few years anyway didn't make sense. He had run the numbers. "You've run the numbers," I said. "I'm trying to help," he said. "This is what I do." I asked him, "When did Ellen ask you to do this?" He paused just briefly. "We discussed it together." "I'm sure you did," I said. He sat forward. He said, "Bernard, you need to think about the future. Helen would have wanted you to be practical. I want you to understand something. Marcus is not, I think, an evil man. He is an ambitious man who had spent 11 years watching my wife manage our family's finances with more competence than I ever had, and he had formed a conclusion about me from that I was passive, manageable, that he knew the shape of me. He thought he was being practical. He didn't know that Helen had been preparing me for this conversation for 8 months before she died. I said, Helen wanted me to be happy. Those aren't the same thing. I said, I'm not selling the house, and I want to be clear that any conversations you've had with realtors on my behalf are not authorized and should stop. He sat back. He said, You don't have to be defensive. I said, I'm not defensive. I'm clear. There's a difference. He left not long after. I sat in the empty kitchen for a while. I looked at the chair he'd been sitting in, Helen's chair, and I thought about her. I thought about the blue keychain in my sock drawer upstairs. I thought about the porch swing in Brevard and the particular quality of mountain light in the late afternoon. I called my son. His name is Peter, and he lives in Portland, and he is a different kind of person from his brother-in-law entirely. I had told Peter about Brevard after Helen died. He'd cried like I did, because knowing she had done that, had planned that far ahead with that kind of love, was almost too much to hold. Peter said whatever I needed, he was there. I told him I thought I was going to move to Brevard in the spring. He said, Good, Dad. That sounds right. I spent the winter quietly. I went through the house and I was deliberate about it, not grieving in a way that was trying to erase anything, but in the way of someone taking stock. I sorted Helen's things with her sister, who came from Tucson for a week in January, and we talked about her and laughed a lot more than we cried, which I think was the right balance. I had dinner with friends. I drove to Brevard in February to check on the house and to meet the property manager who had been handling the rental bookings, a woman named Dale who knew the area well and helped me understand the neighborhood. I started doing things I hadn't done in a while. I went back to fly fishing, which I had loved in my 30s, but let go of somewhere in the middle of raising children and working full-time. I signed up for a woodworking class at the community center, which had been on my list for years. These are not dramatic things, but there is something about doing a small thing you have wanted to do for a long time that is quietly clarifying. Marcus called in February. He said he had a client interested in making an offer on my neighborhood. Not my house specifically, but he was in contact with people. I told him I appreciated the information and that I was not interested. He said the spring market would be competitive. I said, Thank you, Marcus. In March, Ellen came over and I made dinner. After we ate, I told her I had something to tell her. I told her about Brevard. I told her about the house, about the keychain, about Helen sitting across this same table 10 months before she died, with that look on her face that meant she was absolutely certain. I told her about the porch swing in the mountains and calling Helen from there in September and describing the light. Ellen was quiet for a while. Then she started crying, but not the kind of crying I had been afraid of. It was the other kind. She said, I didn't know she did that. I said, She did it for both of us, I think. Ellen looked up. I said, She knew you'd be scared for me. She knew that Marcus would be practical. She wanted everyone to have less to worry about. Ellen said, I'm sorry, Dad. About the brochures. About the realtor. I don't. She shook her head. I got scared and I let him take over, and I'm sorry. I reached across the table and I held her hand. Your mother never held a grudge, I said. Neither will I. We didn't talk about Marcus that evening. I want to be honest. I didn't know yet what Ellen was going to do or what her marriage would look like on the other side of all this. That's not my story to tell. What I can tell you is that when I left for Brevard in April, it was Ellen who helped me load the truck. She drove out for a weekend in June, alone, and we hiked a trail that goes up above the town and looked out over the ridge, green as anything, and she said it was beautiful. She said, Mom was right about this place. I said, she was usually right. We laughed. It was the kind of laugh that has some grief in it still, but not only grief. I've been in Brevard for a while now. The oak tree I planted here, not the one in Phoenix, a new one, just a sapling, is in the backyard getting its footing in the mountain soil. The fly fishing on the Davidson River is better than I had any right to hope for. My neighbor 2 doors down is a retired teacher who plays chess badly and is excellent company. I joined a woodworking group that meets on Tuesday evenings in a garage that smells like cedar shavings and old coffee and is one of the best places I have ever spent a Tuesday. I still have the keychain. The little mountain bluebird. I keep it on my keys even though I don't need it anymore to find the place. I know the drive now, know exactly where the road curves up through the pines and the valley opens below. Helen is all over this house, which surprised me at first. The blue pottery she must have left here from that trip we took to Asheville for our anniversary. The quilt on the guest bed. The stack of mysteries on the shelf in the second bedroom that I have been working through, slowly, like she was leaving them for me to find. She was. I think about Marcus sometimes, not with anger. Anger is a heavy thing to carry into a new life. I think about him as a kind of weather, something that moved through, did what it was going to do, and passed. The last I heard from Ellen, things between them are complicated. That is all I know and all that is mine to know. What I do know is this. My wife spent 3 years building me a door. She did it without being asked, without making it a thing, without ever once suggesting she was doing something extraordinary. She just loved me in the most practical way imaginable. She thought about who I would be when she was gone, and she built accordingly. I try to be worthy of that. I try to take care of this place and this life the way she would have wanted. I try to answer when Peter calls, and I try to be present when Ellen visits. I try not to waste the time I've been given, the quiet mornings, the cold river, the sound of the wood stove on a January night when the mountains are dark and close. Helen always wanted to live somewhere with real seasons. I send her a silent report sometimes when the light is right from the porch. I tell her it's exactly what she planned. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since I moved to Brevard. Not in a mystical way, just in the plain, honest way that life eventually teaches you if you pay attention long enough. Marcus walked into my house 4 days after my wife's funeral and put a folder of real estate listings on my kitchen table. He thought he was being practical, and in his way he had looked at me for 11 years and seen a man who let his wife handle things, and he had concluded that I was handleable. That conclusion was the first link in a chain that ended with him sitting in Helen's chair, telling me what she would have wanted. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't have known, was that Helen had already answered that question herself. 3 years of quiet planning, 1 paid cash house in the mountains, 1 key on a bluebird keychain. She had seen exactly this possibility coming. Maybe not Marcus specifically, but the shape of it, the well-meaning people who would rush in after she was gone and start making decisions in her place. She loved me too much to leave that door open, so she built another one and handed me the key while she still could. That's not luck. That's what happens when someone spends a life paying attention to the person they love. Helen was the most intelligent person I have ever known. Not because she had degrees or titles, but because she understood that real intelligence is knowing what matters before it becomes urgent. She didn't wait for the crisis. She thought ahead with clear eyes and she acted, quietly, without drama, without needing credit for it. I think about the version of me that might have existed without that key, the one who was too numb to push back, who let the folder get opened, who ended up in a Scottsdale community with a monthly rate and a visiting schedule. That man wasn't inevitable, but he was possible. Helen made him impossible. That is what real love looks like when it's also wise. And I think about Ellen. She got scared and she let someone else take the wheel, and some part of her knew it was wrong and she did it anyway. I understand that. Fear makes people hand over the steering. What I respect is that when I told her the truth, all of it, the house, the keychain, her mother sitting at that same table with that look on her face, Ellen didn't defend herself. She cried and she said she was sorry. That takes something. That takes the kind of honesty that is harder than being right. I'm not a man who believes that bad behavior punishes itself automatically, like some cosmic accounting system. I think people get away with things all the time, but I do believe this. The life you build on top of who you actually are will eventually show its foundation. Marcus built his on the assumption that other people's grief was an opportunity. I don't know where he is now in all of it. That's Ellen's story, not mine. My story is the porch in the morning. The Davidson River in October. The wood stove. The stack of mysteries Helen left on the shelf. The sapling oak getting its roots down in mountain soil. I earned this by trusting someone who loved me well enough to plan for my worst days, and I keep it by trying, every morning, to be the man she believed I was. That feels like enough. Most days it feels like more than enough.